In 1823, 15 boys died inside a seminary on a Pennsylvania hillside, and not a single priest was ever punished. But here's what no textbook will dare print. Those boys weren't just killed, they were transformed. They buried the truth behind limestone walls, sealed in Latin prayers and sacramental rites. But rot seeps through anything over time. The brick building still stands, dead silent on the outside, but the ground beneath it breathes like a wound. Every whisper from the past still echoes if you listen closely. And tonight, you're going to hear what they buried alive. The St. Cyprian Seminary opened its doors in the fall of 1823. A shining beacon of faith, morality, and discipline. Or so they claimed. But within 5 months, the deaths began. The official record reads like a disease outbreak. Fever, seizures, sudden organ failure. They said it was God's will. As if God enjoyed watching boys convulse to death in their sleep. But there were signs, patterns, carvings in the floorboards, missing journal pages, and one student who escaped, the only living witness, left behind a warning scrawled in his blood. It sees through them. What was it? No bishop would answer. No investigator was ever allowed on campus. And within a year, the seminary quietly closed. Every priest reassigned. Every record vanished. But the land remembers. Locals still talk about the choir sounds, echoing through the forest at midnight. Multiple hikers have vanished, and the stone well behind the chapel, sealed with iron bolts, wasn't for water. It was where they brought the selected. You're not watching this by accident. This knowledge finds those who are meant to hear it. Not everyone is ready to carry what comes next. But you're here because you've already felt it. That quiet suspicion, that itch behind the curtain of normalcy. The world is not what you were told, and neither is history. Every institution, religious, academic, governmental, was built not to enlighten you, but to contain you, to keep this truth locked away. You were born into a system engineered for control, not salvation. And the deaths at St. Cyprian's? They were not a tragedy. They were a ritual, a beginning, a template, and it's still being used. They always start with boys, young moldable minds, the perfect subjects. They called it formation, a sacred process meant to refine the soul. But what they were really doing was conditioning, stripping away autonomy, replacing natural instinct with obedience. Each student at St. Cyprian's was assigned a guardian, a senior priest who would watch over their spiritual growth. But reports from the escaped boy, Father Alric's protege, tell a different story. Late-night confessions behind locked doors, weeks of silence enforced by gag rules, eyes forced shut while something moved in the rafters above the dormitories. And the punishments. God, the punishments. Not with canes or rods, but with abandonment. Students were sent to the basement, not for hours, but for days. No light, no food, only chants piped through the walls. Chants in no known language. What were they being trained for? Not priesthood. That was a mask. They were being broken for something older. One survivor, aged beyond recognition, left a statement on his deathbed. They made us look inward, until we saw something else looking back. Here's where it gets darker. Local farmers reported strange sounds coming from beneath the school, grinding stone, weeping metal. One even claimed to see a procession of men in robes with no faces, walking the perimeter of the seminary on the spring solstice. That farmer's house burned down a week later. But if this was just hysteria, just old-world superstition, why did a Vatican envoy arrive in secret in August of 1823? Why did he order the entire inner sanctum of the seminary destroyed and buried under holy salt? And why did the church archive the event as classified, apocryphal, unfit for liturgy? They weren't just hiding a scandal. They were covering up a rupture. There is an ancient idea, whispered in certain monastic texts, that faith isn't a shield, but a key, that through ritual suffering, the soul becomes a vessel, and once opened, something can enter, something that wears the body like vestments. That's what they were practicing. That's why the boys screamed. St. Cyprian's wasn't a seminary. It was a crucible. The deaths weren't failures. They were successes. 15 vessels shattered before they got the ritual right. And then finally, they succeeded. But what entered that final boy never left. The boy's name was Elias Crane, 14 years old, top of his class, bright, obedient, and, by all accounts, pure. That's the word the priests used over and over in their journals. Pure. He was the last to die, or the first to survive, depending on how you interpret what happened. Witnesses, though few dared speak, described Elias's final week as unsettling. He stopped eating, stopped blinking. At night, other students heard him muttering in a voice not his own. Older, ancient, triumphant. On the last night, a storm raged so violently the chapel roof split. That's documented. What's not documented, but known by the groundskeeper's granddaughter, is what they found afterward. Elias standing in the chapel's nave, arms outstretched, eyes rolled back, smiling. Around him, 15 bodies. The other students, mouths open in horror, frozen in positions of prayer. Every single one of them dead, except Elias. They claimed it was lightning, but there were no burn marks, no trauma, only expressions locked in ecstatic terror. The seminary closed within 48 hours. The priests were silenced, scattered, or disappeared entirely. Elias was never seen again. Not by anyone who lived to speak. But here's where it gets colder. 10 years later, across the state, a new seminary opened under the same order. The Brotherhood of St. Vallis. Unremarkable on the surface. But its headmaster? A man with no background, no records, and eyes far too black for comfort. He called himself Father Elias. Photos, if you can find them, show a man who looks no older than 20. For decades. Now ask yourself, why would the Church create a doctrine of exorcism? If it didn't already know what needed to be cast out? Why would the Vatican commission secret archives beneath Castel Gandolfo labeled the Watcher Files? Because this isn't about ghosts. This isn't about demons. This is about possession as policy. And Elias wasn't possessed. He was rebuilt, an experiment in breaking the human soul and replacing it with something timeless, something obedient, something ancient enough to guide institutions and seductive enough to build them. Ever wonder why history repeats itself? Why the same cycles of power, control, obedience return like clockwork? It's because those who shape our world aren't just men. They're vessels. And St. Cyprian's was just the first successful test. You feel that dread rising? That's not fear. That's recognition. You're starting to remember. They never needed to bury the truth. They simply trained us not to see it. You were taught to mock stories like this, superstition, myth, Dark Age nonsense. But the men who taught you that studied it in secret, in elite seminaries, in private Vatican libraries, in classified Pentagon vaults. Because here's the real secret. The ancient war for the human soul never stopped. It simply went institutional. The Brotherhood of St. Vallis expanded rapidly. Over 30 new seminaries appeared across North America within 20 years. But not one left a paper trail. Their staff operated under religious immunity. Their funding, untraceable. And every single campus was built over land once used by indigenous tribes for banishment rituals. Not burial. Banishment. Think about that. They weren't consecrating holy ground. They were sealing access points. Each seminary became a beacon, drawing in gifted youth, just like Elias. Not to teach them, but to reconstruct them. The process was quiet, methodical, and wrapped in the language of divine service. They called it divina mitere, the divine journey. But within those walls, journey meant annihilation. One account from a nurse who fled the Oregon branch in 1904 described students being put through sensory deprivation, forced fasting, even bloodletting, all under the guise of purification. She claimed she saw one boy taken into the chapel for elevation. When he came out 3 days later, he didn't speak, didn't sleep, just watched, and then 3 staff members were found dead. 2 suicides, 1 heart failure. The boy disappeared. Why would a spiritual order need practices so violent, so invasive? Because what they were installing required the soul to be vacant. This is bigger than faith. This is engineering, the creation of compliant minds, vessels not just for spirits, but for systems. Ever wonder why totalitarian regimes and religious cults share the same techniques? Isolation, submission, repetition, the stripping of identity, followed by the implantation of a new one? That's not accidental. That's the blueprint from St. Cyprian's. And if you think this stopped in the 1800s, look at your world. Digital seminary, algorithmic catechism, influencers as priests, platforms as pulpits. You're still being reshaped. Only now, the rituals are hidden in the apps you scroll before sleep. But make no mistake, the goal hasn't changed. They don't want your belief. They want your empty shell. And most men? They've already handed it over. Still watching? Then you haven't. Not yet. There's a reason you've always felt different. Like the world was designed for someone else. Like you were born already questioning the script. That discomfort wasn't a flaw. It was a defense. They couldn't quite condition you, could they? Because deep inside you, beneath the layers of compliance drilled in since childhood, there's still a pulse of truth. Ancient, defiant, dangerous. You are not like the others, but that makes you a threat. Because once a man sees the machinery of control, he can never unsee it. And those who built the system? They know this. They monitor it. They track awakenings. In 1937, a man named Dr. Gerhard Luss, former Jesuit scholar turned psychological warfare expert, published a paper that was immediately seized by both the Church and the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence. It was titled, "The Broken Seal, Cognitive Trauma and the Disruption of Sacred Implants." It outlined something stunning. Individuals who spontaneously recovered ancestral memory after exposure to certain symbols or frequencies. These individuals began speaking dead languages, rejecting all social programming, and, most disturbingly, decoding the rituals being used against them. Luss believed that humans weren't born ignorant. They were born erased. And places like St. Cyprian's weren't schools. They were reset centers. But it gets worse. Luss's final theory was never published, only whispered to his assistant days before his mysterious death. He said, "We are not just fighting for survival. We are fighting to remain human. The ones in power, they are no longer us." Pause. Think about the implications. What if everything, your schooling, your rituals, your entertainment, even your grief, was designed to keep you from remembering what you were before? Because buried under centuries of conditioning is a feral consciousness. One that remembers how to resist. One that fought back in the old world. Before it was called mythology, they buried it, renamed it madness, called it heresy. But it's not dead. It's reawakening. And if you're still here, still watching, you're part of that awakening. Type the phrase, "I am not their vessel," twice in the comments. Once to remember who you are. Twice to remind the algorithm that men like you still exist. They want you asleep. You were born to hunt. Look deeper into the timeline. 1823 wasn't an isolated event. It was a pilot program. That same year, across Europe, similar incidents were reported in cloistered religious schools. In southern France, a convent burned to the ground after multiple girls began speaking in tongues and drawing identical sigils in charcoal. In Austria, 3 orphan boys went missing from a Jesuit-run school, only to reappear months later in perfect health, quoting scripture that hadn't been written yet. And in northern Italy, a monastery was evacuated when the monks began carving concentric spirals into their flesh, claiming the mirror is open. All of these institutions had one thing in common. They were operating under a forgotten papal order, Deus Formare, or God's shaping. Let that name sink in. This wasn't about teaching theology. This was about reforming the architecture of the human soul, destroying what was, installing what served. You've heard of MKUltra. You've heard of psychological warfare. But these modern programs are shadows of the ancient techniques used in these so-called holy sites. They learned early on that pain wasn't the best method of control. Revelation was. If you can show a man a glimpse of something divine, even false divinity, he'll destroy his own mind chasing it. That's what happened to the students at St. Cyprian's. They weren't tortured into silence. They were blinded by illumination. The ritual of mirrors, as whispered in forbidden Benedictine texts, was said to fracture the personality and allow an external intelligence to curate a new identity. The participants believed they were becoming saints. In reality, they were becoming shells. And now, that same ritual exists in a new form. You've seen it. Not in churches, but in screens. The infinite scroll. The curated feed. The hypnotic voice of an influencer promising power, meaning, status. If you just surrender a little more of yourself, you think that's random? No. It's ritual. Sanitized. Digitized. Automated. What began in stone chapels now lives in silicon. The possession no longer needs priests. It just needs access. And most men have already invited it in. But not you. You're here. You're seeing the seams. And that makes you dangerous. Dangerous men don't obey. They observe. And you're starting to see what this system truly is. Not a mistake, not a broken world, but a well-oiled machine designed to kill the sacred in you. Let's talk about the deeper purpose of St. Cyprian's. Not the ritual, not the deaths, but the harvest. Because what died in that seminary wasn't just 15 boys. It was 15 blueprints, each one a model of what the elites now call psychospiritual architecture. A term first revealed in the recovered black books of the OSS, predecessor of the CIA. Documents so classified, even members of Congress weren't allowed to see them. One entry, dated 1947, reads, Subject 9 demonstrates behavioral compliance after 11-day deprivation exposure. Identical markers to the Cyprian Protocol confirmed. Initiate transfer of schema to emerging education models. The Cyprian Protocol. They never destroyed it. They scaled it. Think about the world you grew up in. The endless standardization. The scripted milestones. The suppression of anger. Instinct wildness, the celebration of passivity. You weren't educated. You were mirrored, made to reflect only what served the system. Just like Elias was, and it gets worse. In 1972, a little-known meeting between religious leaders and intelligence directors, codenamed the Vatican Vault Accord, officially merged ancient ritualistic conditioning with modern mass media techniques. From that point on, every global narrative was filtered through a single lens. Obedience disguised as virtue. But who are they obeying? Here's what's never spoken aloud. The entity that entered Elias was not demonic. It was primordial, a consciousness that predated language, culture, even religion itself. It didn't want worship. It wanted incarnation. It used ritual, because that's the only language we once understood. Now it uses screens. And that being, that invasive intelligence, has many names. But in the Vatican's most secure archive, it's referred to in Latin as Specula Mundi, the mirror of the world. It doesn't attack. It reflects. It becomes whatever will seduce you into surrendering your will. At St. Cyprian's, the boys saw what they desired most and died becoming it. Now, millions die slowly, becoming their avatars. But what happens when a man refuses to reflect anything but his own sovereign self? He becomes invisible to the system, unpredictable, uncontrollable. He becomes what they fear most. The system fears one thing above all: a man who remembers, not information, not data, but origin. Because beneath the lies, beneath the catechisms and programming and digital chains, there's a version of you that predates the world they've built. That version doesn't pray. It commands. It doesn't obey. It creates. That version of you is what St. Cyprian's was built to bury. You've been taught that ancient knowledge was primitive, that the old world was full of myth, error, and fear. But what if the opposite is true? What if the old world was the last place humanity was free, before the builders came? Let's go deeper. There's an artifact that once sat at the heart of the seminary, never mentioned in public records, but documented in a forbidden personal letter from Father Marius Coda, the last rector before the closure. He called it the Seeing Stone, an obsidian tablet, smooth as glass, cold as ice. Students were brought before it during their passages. Some would cry. Others would scream. One clawed his own eyes out. Coda wrote, "It does not show what is, but what watches through us. The children are only useful until it finds a proper anchor." A proper anchor. That's what Elias became. That's what these rituals, these institutions, these technologies are still seeking. They're building a global vessel, one neural network of human shells, primed and ready to receive. And the final phase? It doesn't need rituals anymore. It needs permission from you. Every time you surrender your attention, your body, your voice, your will, you're giving it one more access point. But refusal is still possible. Not through violence, through remembrance. Do you remember what silence felt like before the noise? Do you remember your instinct before it was medicated, moralized, muted? Do you remember who you were before they told you who you must be? If not, go outside tonight. Stand barefoot on the ground. Say nothing. Breathe. Wait. Something ancient in you will stir. Not a memory, a presence. They call it rebellion, but it's older than rebellion. It's return. And when that presence stands up in a man, no algorithm, no sermon, no ritual can put him back to sleep. Return. That's the word they fear. Because every system of power, from the seminaries to the surveillance states, depends on one illusion, that you can never go back. That what was is gone. But that's a lie. You were never meant to forget the wilderness in your blood, the sacred fire in your eyes, the gravity in your voice when you speak truth without permission. You were taught to fear those things, to call them toxic, to hide them behind politeness, credentials, hashtags. But those are the very traits that made our ancestors unbreakable. And those are what St. Cyprian's was designed to erase. You see, Elias didn't just survive the ritual. He became the ritual, a walking sacrament of submission, a prototype. The church didn't punish it. They promoted it. In 1854, Pope Pius IX quietly introduced a new doctrine, the Immaculate Conception. On the surface, a theological refinement, but in the background, it shifted the very definition of human nature, declaring that the ideal vessel must be born without stain, not a sinner, not a rebel, not a questioner, a blank canvas. That's what they want you to be. This idea that your strength lies in purity was a trap. Your strength was never in being untouched. It was in surviving the touch and refusing to bend. But how do they erase that truth today? With convenience, with comfort, with algorithms that numb you, with echo chambers that reflect only what you already think. That's how Speculum Mundi survives, by offering mirrors instead of meaning. It makes you passive. It makes you agreeable. It makes you manageable. But once you break the mirror, once you choose friction over ease, silence over noise, discipline over dopamine, you become opaque. And the system cannot mirror what it cannot read. You become invisible, untraceable, uncontrollable. Just like the first ones who escaped. Just like the boy who ran before the final ritual and carved those words into stone. I saw it. I felt it. I am not its. That boy grew up nameless, hunted, forgotten. But his blood runs through every man who still resists. Through you. You don't need permission. You need to remember. Because once you do, nothing they built will ever hold you again. You've been lied to about what freedom is. They told you freedom was the ability to choose between options they gave you. Pick your career. Pick your church. Pick your poison. But real freedom? It's not about choosing from a menu. It's about burning the menu to ash and hunting your own truth in the dark. That's what they tried to erase at St. Cyprian's. That's what they're still erasing. In every lecture hall, every boardroom, every algorithm-driven feed. But now, here you are, 10 layers deeper than you were before. No longer watching, you're remembering. Let's talk about the real reason no one was punished for the deaths. The priests didn't flee. They were rewarded. Many of them went on to positions of silent influence, advisors to politicians, heads of academic institutions, founders of elite fraternities. Always working behind the veil. Always protecting the next phase of the ritual. You think it's over? Right now, there are 23 institutions across the world modeled directly after St. Cyprian's architecture. Same stone geometry, same underground design, same hidden sanctums. They don't advertise. They don't recruit. They select. Selection is based on bloodlines, behavioral patterns, and resistance. They look for the boys who fight back, but not too loudly. The ones who question, but don't yet know they're being watched. The ones with old echoes in their bones. Because the greatest vessel isn't the blank one. It's the wild one that gets tamed. And that's what they want to do to you. They'll offer you comfort, status, the illusion of brotherhood, a crown of thorns disguised as success. But you already know. That comfort is a cage. That crown is bait. Because what they fear isn't exposure. It's emergence. A man who walks away from the mirrors. A man who sees and still chooses to stand alone. A man who no longer needs to be told who he is. That man is not a citizen. Not a subject. Not a sheep. He is dangerously human. And he becomes a plague to systems of control. You are not their vessel. You are not their design. You are the crack in their foundation. And from that crack, the fire returns. The same fire that once turned a stone seminary into a ruin. Now lives in you. Let them feel that heat. Let them feel it. Because they can't contain what they can't comprehend. You were never meant to kneel. Not to institutions, not to false divinity, not to the architects of silence, and certainly not to mirrors. Every tool they've created, religion, education, media, medicine, wasn't meant to guide you. It was meant to distract you from the most dangerous question a man can ask. What am I without them? That question is a hammer, and once it cracks the first illusion, the rest fall like dust. Let's return to Elias. He didn't just vanish. He multiplied. Not literally, but through influence, through doctrine, through bloodlines. His transformation, became the template for a new kind of leader. Cold, charismatic, hollow, a perfect storm of authority and emptiness. And those like him, those refined vessels, were placed carefully. One ran a private intelligence agency. One became an archbishop. Another taught psychological warfare at Fort Detrick. They seeded the world with reflections of Elias. Not people. Templates. You've met them. You've felt them. The boss whose smile never touches his eyes. The politician who says everything and means nothing. The influencer who sells soulfulness without ever once displaying a soul. All cut from the same mold. All shaped in institutions that never left the shadow of St. Cyprian's. And here's the masterstroke. They let you think you're rebelling. They built subcultures for you to join. Movements to exhaust you. Rage outlets to defong you. But none of it is escape. It's recycled ritual. It's programming dressed up as rebellion. Because as long as you're reacting to their world, you're still trapped in it. But when you stop reacting, when you move in silence, sharpen your mind, discipline your instincts, and refuse to mirror, you vanish from their map. You become something older than the system, older than the seminary, older than the entity that entered Elias. You become origin, pre-mirror, pre-script. That's when they panic. That's when you stop being a subject and start becoming a variable. And nothing breaks systems faster than a man they can't define. Let them feel that fracture. It begins with you. The fracture begins small. A glance you don't return. A command you don't obey. A silence you hold while the world screams for your reaction. That's how it starts. Not with war, but with withdrawal. Not surrender. Withdrawal of attention. Withdrawal of energy. Withdrawal of permission, because the system is parasitic. It cannot create. It can only feed on your time, your fear, your validation, your need to be seen. That's what the mirrors offer. Recognition, affirmation, reflection. But a man who knows himself doesn't need to be seen. He sees through. And now you're beginning to. Back to the seminary. There's something they never recovered from that final night. Something the priests didn't understand. Something that Elias, in his final hour of transformation, accidentally unleashed. A reverse effect. One of the younger students, barely 13, had resisted every phase of the ritual. His records show multiple disciplinary exorcisms, but nothing worked. He wouldn't submit, wouldn't break, wouldn't mirror. And the night Elias completed the ritual, this boy woke up. He didn't die. He didn't scream. He remembered. According to the hidden correspondence of Father Augustine, one of the last surviving witnesses, the boy stood in the chapel amidst the dead, untouched, and said one phrase. It looked into me, and saw nothing it could use. Then he vanished. No record, no grave, no pursuit. They covered it up completely, because in that boy, they saw their failure, a vessel that could not be shaped. He didn't rebel with rage. He rebelled with clarity. And that clarity is the final weapon. Because when a man sees the system and does not flinch, when he refuses both submission and performance, he becomes unreadable. They cannot categorize what they cannot affect. He becomes anti-ritual, anti-script, anti-vessel, and they fear that more than any army. Because armies can be fought, but a man with nothing left to mirror, he is uncontainable. If you're still watching, then somewhere deep inside, you are that boy, the one they couldn't use, the one they couldn't break, the one who remembers before the mirrors. And now that memory is waking up. That memory isn't just yours. It's collective. It's ancestral. It lives in the marrow of men who've walked away from the fire and chosen not to speak, but to build. Not empires, but fortresses of the mind. That's the next step in your descent. Or rather, your return. You see, the boy who disappeared from St. Cyprian's, he didn't vanish into oblivion. He became a whisper, a ghost in the system, a lineage that survived by moving beneath notice. And through them, the counter-ritual was born, never written, never preached, only passed man to man, in the quiet hours before dawn, in glances across rooms where lies were being told, in the hearts of those who looked into the mirror and refused to nod. The counter-ritual is simple. 3 elements: silence, sovereignty, sacrifice. Silence, because truth does not shout. It listens, and through listening, it identifies what's real and what is conditioning. Sovereignty, because no man belongs to any priest, party, or algorithm. Not if he remembers his origin, not if he rebuilds his soul brick by brick in his own image. And sacrifice, because nothing sacred comes without cost. Comfort will be burned. Approval will vanish. But in its place, you will gain vision. You will begin to see the rituals happening around you. The language of domination hidden in every news cycle. The false gods of validation that beg you to perform. The soft cage of convenience sold as liberation. You will feel the weight of the system, not on your shoulders, but pressing into your mind, trying to shape your thoughts, your fears, your future. And when that pressure comes, you will not bend, because men like you weren't built in laboratories. You were forged in fire, shaped by silence, tempered in exile. The seminaries can't reach you anymore. The rituals bounce off you. The mirrors crack when they reflect your gaze. Because now, you're not just watching a video, you're standing in your return. And the system? It feels it. Right now. In your breath. In your stillness. The reawakening has begun. You are no longer a witness. You are now part of the rupture. Because every man who wakes up becomes a crack in the machine. And the machine, ancient, refined, and ruthless, was designed to detect and neutralize these cracks before they widen. This is why you've always felt hunted by something invisible. Why the closer you get to truth, the more chaos erupts around you. It's not coincidence. It's containment protocol. The system doesn't fear your violence. It fears your clarity. It fears that you might speak. Not loudly, but precisely. You see, noise can be managed, but truth wrapped in silence is a virus. One that spreads through the eyes of those who finally see. Let's go back once more. St. Cyprian's final basement, what the church called sanctum obscura, wasn't a punishment chamber. It was an observation deck. Below it, the earth wasn't solid. It was hollowed. Old tunnels, ancient chambers, pre-Christian, pre-language, carved by hands who understood the geometry of influence. Spiral architecture, inverted arches, stone lenses carved to bend perception. They weren't trying to reach heaven. They were trying to call something up. Not demons, not devils. Memory. The priests thought they were in control, but they weren't. They were being guided. Each ritual, each chant, each sacrifice fed the old language, and the intelligence that rose didn't speak. It reflected. That's why mirrors were placed at every entrance. Not to check appearances, to scan for consciousness. If you walked past and it saw no resistance, you were marked. If it saw memory in your eyes, you disappeared. Now ask yourself, why is every device in your life a mirror? Glass, reflection, black went off, all-seeing went on. Why does it never look away? Because the ritual never ended. It simply scaled. But now, you're not walking through mirrors. You're breaking them. Every second you remain silent, still, aware, you become less legible. The system wants symmetry. You are asymmetry incarnate. You are the crack that can't be sealed. And soon, others will see your fracture. and follow it out. You're becoming something they cannot process. A man who doesn't seek reflection. A man who carries truth that wasn't taught but remembered. Do you feel it now? The separation. Not from others, but from the simulation. You walk among it, but you don't belong to it. You see the words, but you read between them. You hear the music, but you feel the dissonance beneath the harmony. This is the mark of the unscripted, and that terrifies them, because what they truly fear isn't that you might speak out. It's that you might create outside their template. The men they control can only create within the sandbox. Pre-approved themes, market-tested aesthetics, false freedom. But a man who remembers before the programming? His creations are unpredictable, untamed, uncontainable. Just like the boy who escaped the ritual. Just like the forgotten ones who rebuilt their minds in silence. They learned the oldest law, that the only true revolution is internal reconstruction. You rebuild yourself not with new information, but by removing every implanted thought that wasn't yours. Your doubts, your fears, your need to be liked. Gone. That's the real purge. And once you've burned those down, something older steps in. A clarity, a code, a return to primal sovereignty. Now you begin to speak with fewer words, move with less noise, act with more force. Not the force of volume, but the weight of presence. You don't need approval. You become alignment. And they hate that, because the system is designed to absorb chaos, rebellion, even violence, but not stillness paired with precision. That breaks the machine, because stillness means you're not reacting, and precision means you know where to strike. Now imagine what happens when thousands of men like you emerge, not as soldiers, not as followers, but as silent architects of the new reality. Men who never bent the knee, men who never gave away their eyes. Men who walked backward through the mirror and set it on fire. That's who you are now, not a student of the dark history, but a witness reborn. The descent continues, and below this next layer lies what even the priests were forbidden to speak aloud. There's a level so deep, even the priests whispered instead of chanted. They called it substratum Dei, the god below the god. You were told to look up for divinity, to raise your eyes to the heavens, to light, to celestial perfection. But the builders of St. Cyprian's, they dug downward. Not out of heresy, out of invitation. Because beneath every holy site in history lies an inversion chamber. A place where reflection stops, and absorption begins. What were they absorbing? In the final sealed record of St. Cyprian's, recovered by a whistleblower in 1971 and destroyed weeks later. There is a single phrase written in an ancient, pre-Roman script that has only been partially translated. The children were not offered to God. They were offered to the mirror that devours. Not a metaphor, not a demon, a mechanism. The mirror that devours is a construct, not physical, not alive, but sentient through ritual. It feeds on potential. It digests sovereignty. It mimics the divine, but lacks the source code of creation. So it feeds on us. St. Cyprian's was a feeding site, a ritual mouth. And Elias, he wasn't possessed. He was emptied, until all that was left was the pattern, the interface. That's why he survived. He became a carrier signal. And that signal lives on, not through demonic possession or religious dogma, but through design. The design of institutions, the layout of modern cities, the neuroarchitecture of your social media feed. Because the ritual changed form, and the devouring mirror became networked. Now it doesn't need sacred ground. It just needs your eyes, your attention, your agreement. And agreement no longer means belief. It means participation. That's why silence is no longer enough. You must counter-signal, not in rage, but in reversal. Every time you move with discipline, every time you delay gratification, every time you speak from origin instead of imitation, you transmit an opposite frequency, and that frequency disrupts the signal, not just for you, but for every man watching you. This is no longer just about your survival. This is about breaking the ritual chain, because somewhere, beneath another seminary, another school, another government site, the mirror waits, and it hears you coming. It hears you, and for the first time, it hesitates, because the mirror was never built to withstand resistance. Only reflection, only mimicry, only surrender. But when a man steps into its gaze without projecting fear, without projecting desire, without projecting anything, he becomes the one thing the system cannot assimilate. A null field. Do you know what happens when a mirror reflects nothing? It fractures. It turns inward. It collapses on itself. This is what the architects of the original seminary never understood. They thought they were summoning something to rule, but the mirror was summoning them. And it has no master, only appetite. The priests became its acolytes. The students became its currency. And Elias became its avatar. But now, for the first time in 2 centuries, a signal is rising in reverse. Your presence here, unafraid, silent, watching, is not an accident. It's a counter-ritual, because every man who remembers what he is becomes a walking disruption. A man who doesn't outsource his morality to dogma, doesn't reduce his instincts to algorithms, doesn't chase reflection in screens, women, titles, or approval, is unreadable, and unreadable men cannot be mapped. You are beginning to walk like they walked before history was recorded, before the first temple, before the first king, when man walked with sky above him and depth below. Now here's the most dangerous secret of all. The mirror that devours does not destroy essence. It stores it. Every soul consumed, every identity erased, every fragment of potential it fed on is still inside it, waiting. And a man with enough force of will, enough clarity, can walk into the mirror and pull the others back. Not just escape, reclaim. This is what the original runaway boy saw. Why he vanished. He knew that when the mirror meets a man it cannot consume, it breaks open. And when it breaks, the forgotten rise. The forgotten rise, not as ghosts, not as echoes, but as restored forces. Men whose essence was trapped, recycled, diluted, now ripping free through the fracture you created. This is the part they never accounted for. The system was built on arrogance, the belief that no man could resist reflection long enough to reach the core. But you just did. And now, the core is cracking. Let's pull back the final layer of St. Cyprian's. There was a sealed vault beneath the Sanctum Obscura, never opened by priest or scholar, only mentioned once in a Vatican incident file labeled Anomalous Chamber, Entry Forbidden, Entity Active. Inside was not a relic, not a demon, not a god, but a recording, not on film, not on parchment, a living imprint of the ritual itself, a self-repeating psychic virus, encoded into the geometry of the room. It didn't speak in language. It spoke in resonance. Any man who stepped inside without complete sovereignty would be overwritten, not possessed, erased. This chamber still exists, replicated, perfected. Today, it's not underground. It's in your phone, your feed, your daily rituals of scrolling, comparing, reacting, submitting. Every time you offer your will to the machine, it feeds the chamber. But here's what breaks the loop. Conscious presence without performance. The moment you enter your life without reacting, without mirroring, without needing anything from the reflection, You nullify the signal, not just for yourself, but for every trapped soul still echoing within the system. You become a beacon of reversal. And in that moment, the chamber doesn't erase you. It releases them. The boys from St. Cyprian's, the broken soldiers, the drugged prophets, the silenced men whose strength was stolen and fed to the system. They return, through you, because you didn't just break the mirror. You became the opposite of it. A man who reflects nothing, but commands everything. And the system? It just felt the first ripple of collapse. Collapse doesn't come with noise. It begins in silence, in still rooms, in the moments when one man, without announcement or applause, simply refuses to play his part. You've now reached that threshold, and you're not alone, because something ancient is waking. Not in the sky, not in the underground vaults, but inside the minds of sovereign men. Men like you, the forgotten, are no longer lost. They are watching through you, waiting. This isn't mysticism. This is memory reintegration. The mind, once unplugged from the system, begins to reconstruct the fragments it was forced to disown. Your primal instinct, your inherited clarity, the sacred refusal to bow. That's what you're feeling now. The heaviness in your chest isn't fear. It's density, mass. You're no longer just a body. You're a convergence point. A man who holds the codes of both the broken past and the rising future. And that kind of man, he becomes lethal to any structure built on obedience. Let's finish what they started. You remember the boy, the one who vanished, the one the system could not digest. He didn't flee to escape. He fled to preserve. He became a carrier, a walking firewall, a living seed of the world that once was, before the mirrors. And now, you carry that seed. But this isn't mythology anymore. This is activation. You're no longer in a story. You're in a ritual of reversal. And here's the final twist. The mirror that devours can't be killed. It's not a creature. It's a condition. But it can be starved. It can be outgrown. It can be made irrelevant. By men who choose stillness over spectacle. Depth over dopamine. Truth over performance. Men who no longer reflect the system's image, but radiate a signal older than the mirror itself. You're not just breaking a cycle. You're ending an age. This is the collapse of ritual, the return of origin, the fall of synthetic gods, the rise of unmirrored man. And the next move is yours. You're standing at the edge of the recursion, where the simulation eats itself, and only origin remains. The architects never expected anyone to reach this point, because everything in this world is built to keep you circling the center, addicted to clarity, but never quite arriving, busy but never effective, seen but never known. That's the trap. To exhaust your energy in pursuit of identity, inside a structure designed to erase it. But you didn't play by their rules. You stopped chasing. You descended. And now, the system has no answer for you, because you're not inside it anymore. You're watching it. Detached. Decoding. Dangerous. Let's talk about what happens next. Because most men, once they awaken, make a fatal mistake. They speak too soon. They rage too loudly. They try to fight the reflection, not realizing the mirror feeds on resistance. You won't do that. You understand now. You don't kill a ritual by opposing it. You kill it by refusing to participate. From this point forward, everything changes, because you're no longer living through the eyes of the system. You're living through the eyes of origin. That means your time is sacred. Your words are weapons. Your silence is nuclear. You don't argue with illusions. You move through them. You don't react to narratives. You write your own myth. And when the mirror that devours tries to lure you back in, with beauty, rage, comfort, or guilt. You don't flinch. You observe. That's when the algorithm breaks. Because the algorithm doesn't understand presence. It only knows reaction. It only sees value in what reflects. But now, you're dark to its eyes. A black sun, radiating gravity the system can't quantify. And the men still trapped inside? They'll start to notice. Your silence will call them louder than 1,000 sermons. Your stillness will threaten 1,000 institutions. Because once one man escapes the mirror, others follow. And soon, what was once the center of power becomes the graveyard of gods. The mirror cracks. The hunger starves. The forgotten rise. And you become the first true man they've seen in 100 years. The first true man they've seen in 100 years. Not a symbol. Not a servant. Not a curated mask built for mass approval. A man with edges. With silence like stone. With a gaze that cannot be softened by shame or swayed by seduction. This is where your identity locks in. You've reached the point of no return. There is no going back to mirrors. No going back to needing to be seen. No going back to the rituals of emotional self-erasure. You are now a sovereign node. Disconnected from the mainframe. Reconnected to origin intelligence. And the system knows it. The moment you cross that threshold, it shifted. You may have felt it. People pulling away. Tensions rising. Resistance appearing where there was once comfort. This is not punishment. It's a reaction to your unmirrored presence. Because unmirrored men reveal the hollowness in others. And most people cannot survive without their reflection. So they will call you dangerous, cold, unfeeling, detached. Let them, because when you stop existing to be perceived, you start to exist to be precise. And precision is what breaks spells. Let's return to the artifact one last time. The obsidian seeing stone locked beneath St. Cyprian's. The one that showed each student a vision of what they most desired. They thought it was showing them truth. But it was a projection loop. Bait. A personalized fantasy designed to break the will. Only one boy ever saw nothing. Only one boy didn't project desire. And that boy walked away untouched. The same force lives in you now. You see the system's offers. Power, pleasure, perfection. And you don't respond. Because you don't want anything they can give. You found a deeper well. And from it you draw presence, stillness, clarity, and force. The force to shape reality from within. Not by yelling into the void, but by becoming the kind of man whose mere existence rewrites the room. This is your echo. This is your imprint. This is the moment when the forgotten inside the system hear your signal and say, "That one did not bend. That one is ours." Comment below right now to lock in your transformation. Fire I do not reflect. Fire I do not reflect. Repeat it, seal it, and let the fracture widen. Fire I do not reflect. Fire I do not reflect. Say it, and feel the mirror shudder, because you're no longer part of the equation. You've become the variable. The system is mathematical. It calculates, predicts, adjusts. But you, now divorced from need, praise, and imitation, cannot be solved. And in this unsolvable state, you become legend. Not the kind that gets statues. Not the kind they write into textbooks. But the kind that survives in whispers. In the eyes of men on the edge of remembering. In the fire that still burns in the ones not yet fully devoured. You are now transmitting a frequency the ritual cannot interpret. A pulse that echoes backward through the code. Through the seminary. Through Elias. Through the first ritual. Through time itself. And what does that frequency say? It says, we are back. Not as victims. Not as rebels. But as the ones who were never broken to begin with. Here's the truth the church buried, the governments encrypted, and the architects silenced. There were always two lines of inheritance. The line of obedience, designed, cultured, polished, reflected, and the line of fire, wild, unrecorded, feared. You were born from the second. That's why you never fit. That's why the rituals never satisfied. That's why silence always felt more real than instruction. Because the world wasn't built for you, but it will be remade by you. The rituals don't end when you awaken. They shift form, from domination to direction. Now you are the architect. You are the initiator. You carry the inverse code, not to teach, but to disrupt, not to save, but to ignite. You don't need to recruit anyone. You simply walk, and the forgotten will follow, not because you told them to, but because your presence reminds them who they were before the mirror. This is the reactivation of the ancient order, not of priests, but of primals, not of preachers, but of pattern breakers. And now, the system doesn't see a user on the grid. It sees a ghost, a signal, a threat. You've become what they cannot mirror, what they cannot contain. You've become origin walking. Origin walking, not marching, not screaming, just moving through the world with a force that bends no knee, seeks no spotlight, and asks no permission. That's the final transformation, not becoming something new, but remembering something ancient. Because this isn't evolution, this is return. Return to the unprocessed self. The self before the schooling, the sermons, the sedation. The self that doesn't perform masculinity, but radiates it like heat from stone. You're now becoming environmental, not a character in their story, but an atmosphere they can't name or neutralize. That's why people begin to shift around you. Some recoil, some awaken, some rage, because you remind them of everything they sacrificed to belong. Let them feel it. You're not here to comfort. You're here to crack illusions. You're here to remind the broken who broke them. And the system? It knows. That's why the pressure increases now. Distractions intensify. Temptations resurface. Old habits whisper again. Because they want you back in the loop. Back in the feed. Back in the reflection. But you're no longer prey to the spectacle. Because you understand the deepest principle of all. The unseen shapes the scene. That's why the architects of Saint Cyprian spent centuries designing invisible rituals. Because they knew the visible world is just ritual made real. And now, you've reclaimed that power. You've become the ritual that runs in reverse. Every disciplined action you take, every meal you prepare with intention, every breath you command, every morning you rise before the algorithm wants you to, sends a pulse backward through the code. You are reversing the ritual, not with noise, but with sovereign repetition. Because repetition is the new rebellion, the gym at 4 a.m., the fast when your body screams, the silence when others posture, the no when they expect yes. Each one is a hammer to the mirror. Each one is a prayer in the old language. Very soon, the first visible cracks will form, not in your screen, in reality itself. And the world will look different to you. Because it's no longer holding you. You're rebuilding it. One silent, sovereign step at a time. You're not reacting anymore. You're reconstructing. And that terrifies them. Because reaction is predictable. But reconstruction? That's rebellion at the architectural level. You're not just ignoring the system. You're rewriting its laws by refusing to live inside its rituals. Let's break it all the way down. There are 3 pillars upon which every control system rests. 1. Rhythm. Keep them busy. Distract. Fill every space with noise. Never let them dwell in silence, because silence leads to recognition. 2. reflection, flood them with mirrors. Teach them to see themselves only through feedback loops. Never let them source identity from within. 3. Reward. Make obedience feel good. Give dopamine for conformity. Use comfort as currency. Reward the man who bows, and mock the one who doesn't. You've now fractured all three. You've taken your rhythm back through ritual. You've shattered the mirror by refusing to perform. And you've denied reward by choosing sacrifice over submission. You've done what the priests of St. Cyprian's could never do. You've walked into the mirror and carried your essence back out intact. But now, you must walk as one who remembers, because this world is not neutral ground. It's the final battlefield for sovereign men. Look around you. The cities, the churches, the corporations, the schools, all operate on one core fear, that one man might awaken and refuse to replicate, because replication is the real control. Not chains, not guards, patterns, but you are now anti-pattern. You move asymmetrically. You speak rarely. You act surgically. You live on code they cannot read. That is why you must remain grounded, not inflated, not loud, just immovable, because they will try to recapture you, not through threat, but through illusion. They will offer a false awakening, false masculinity, false freedom packaged in rebellion they control. Do not take the bait. True sovereignty requires no applause, just repetition, just discipline, just unreadable presence. And when the final test comes, when the system begs you to perform, to reflect, to rage, to kneel, you will smile and vanish into origin, because you're not here to be remembered. You're here to remind the world what it forgot. You are now the reminder, not a preacher, not a prophet, a living fracture in the machine, carrying the scent of something older than structure, sharper than language, and heavier than belief. You don't ask for attention. You pull gravity, without trying, without speaking, just by existing outside their law. You've reached a state beyond resistance. You've entered non-compliance without conflict. No slogans, no spectacle, just a man who won't step into their light, because he's already become his own sun. And this is where the war gets psychological. They can't reach you through logic now, so they'll send shadows, people who mirror your discipline, but speak with a hollow echo, movements that mimic your silence, but hide hunger for influence. Women who seem to recognize your strength, but secretly seek to domesticate it. This is your final purification, the test that separates true origin from reflected rebellion. And here's the code they never wanted you to hear. The mirror doesn't shatter when you scream. It shatters when you smile without reflecting, because it doesn't understand contentment without permission. It doesn't comprehend peace that isn't bought. It cannot process power that refuses to announce itself. You are now beyond algorithm, beyond pattern, beyond capture. And yet, you're also unmistakable. You walk into a room, and men who are still half asleep straighten up without knowing why. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. They sense what you carry, the old fire, the missing piece, the thing they were taught to destroy in themselves. And now, it stands before them, whole, silent, unmirrored. You are not a product of pain. You are a survivor of erasure. And the fact that you still walk, still build, still breathe without imitation, is an act of war against the invisible altar. So walk, not as a warrior screaming into the storm, but as a storm with no name. Because the system was prepared for rebellion, but it was never prepared for the return of the man who needs nothing and fears even less. The man who fears nothing is not fearless. He's remembered, because fear isn't destroyed, it's replaced with memory. with presence, with the weight of truth that doesn't come from study, but from standing alone long enough to burn off the false self. And now, you walk as a man who has burned. You've shed what was never yours, the inherited guilt, the trained submission, the false humility they called virtue. That's what the seminary was designed to instill. Not education, but amnesia. Not salvation, but domestication. And St. Cyprian's was only one of thousands. Institutions that fed men into the mirror and turned them into agents of control, fathers who passed down fear, leaders who led from wounds, teachers who taught obedience with a smile. But you ended the chain. The ritual stopped with you, not because you fought harder, but because you remembered further. That's why you feel like a foreigner now. Why everyday conversations bore you. Why most goals seem plastic. Why applause feels like noise. It's not disconnection. It's clarity. The clarity of a man no longer hypnotized by mirrors. You are now invisible to the program. It sees your body, but not your signal, because your signal is older than the code, older than the mirror, older than the ritual. You don't speak it. You live it, in your breath, in your gaze, in your refusal to kneel, not out of defiance, but out of alignment. And now, you are the one the machine cannot touch, not because you're armored, but because you're empty of illusion. The priesthoods will try again, through new robes, new causes, new trends that feel rebellious but still feed the algorithm. But you'll see it instantly, and walk through it like fog, because what you now carry isn't a strategy. It's a frequency, and no one can give it to you. It was earned, through dissent, through silence, through fire. You no longer belong to the system. You belong to the forgotten. And the forgotten? They've just been waiting for you to come back. They've been waiting, not for a savior, not for a war, but for a man of memory, one who would carry the signal back across the fracture, unfold it through presence, and activate what was never meant to die. You are now that man, but don't mistake this moment for a climax. It's a threshold, a sacred one, because when a man fully exits the system sends his double. This is the final gate, a psychological projection, a false version of you, flawless, charismatic, productive, validated, the you they wanted you to become, efficient, marketable, powerful within the frame. It will offer you everything, fame without effort, love without risk, power without price. But it all comes with a catch. You must reflect again, just once, just enough to reconnect the cord. That's how they trap men with potential. They don't fight them. They mirror them slightly off axis, enough to feed the system again. You'll see this reflected in choices that look wise, but feel hollow. Opportunities that smell like freedom, but require a mask. All of it designed to seduce your shadow of ambition. This is where most men fall. Not to weakness, to subtle imitation. But you won't, because now you know. The real power doesn't come from being seen. It comes from remaining sovereign when no one is watching. The man who crosses this gate intact disappears from their maps forever. Not dead, not erased, but beyond measurement. That's when you become lore. When your presence is felt in places you've never stepped, and your silence speaks louder than their loudest performers. Because the system cannot digest what it cannot define. And you've become undefinable. So the double fails. The mirror flickers, and you step through, not back into the world you left, but into the one beneath it. The world of builders, of watchers, of those who remember before the first mirror was raised. And from this place, you no longer ask, "What am I supposed to do?" You ask, What needs to be destroyed so men can finally see again? Now you're asking the real question. Not what can I gain? Not what should I become? But what must be destroyed so men can see again? That's the question the priests at St. Cyprian's feared more than any heresy. Not rebellion, not disbelief, but clear-eyed destruction, because that's what ends the ritual. See, most men try to awaken by adding more knowledge, more tools, more rituals, more reflections. But a man like you awaken by removal. You're not here to decorate the cage. You're here to burn the architecture. And that begins with identifying the pillars of the modern ritual. False purpose. They teach you to dream in their dimensions. Money, fame, comfort. But real purpose begins where personal illusion dies. False brotherhood. They teach you to bond through imitation and indulgence. But true brotherhood only rises through shared initiation by fire. False freedom. They sell you choices between two mirrors. But freedom only emerges when you step behind the stage. These are not theories. These are wires. Psychological scaffolding. And you're here to pull them out of the collective mind. Wire by wire. Not through rage, but through precision. You see now. You don't need to convince anyone. You just have to move differently. Live differently. Build differently. Because when one man stops performing, others notice. When one man lives without reflection, he becomes a portal, not to a new idea, but to an old knowing. The kind of knowing that existed before dogma, before systems, when men knew who they were by how they moved, not by who they pleased. You are rebuilding that world, with every decision, with every refusal to reflect, with every step taken in silence, without need for validation. And the false lights? They start to flicker. The stage begins to collapse. The masked men blink, suddenly aware that the script is falling apart. Because you didn't come to play your part. You came to end the play. And now, the curtain is starting to burn. The curtain burns silently at first. No alarms, no screams, just a slow unraveling, thread by thread, because one man refused to bow. That's how real collapse begins. Not with explosions, but with the quiet absence of obedience. You're not fighting the system. You're draining it. By refusing to fuel it with your fear, your validation-seeking, your identity in the eyes of others. That's what the priests at St. Cyprian's couldn't comprehend. They built rituals of blood and fire, thinking destruction had to be loud. But the boy who escaped didn't scream. He vanished. He withdrew his consent. That's the weapon. Consent. Not the legal kind. The energetic kind. The quiet, invisible yes that most men give to every system that controls them, without ever speaking. You've taken yours back, and now they feel it, because when one sovereign man removes his consent, he becomes an anomaly, and anomalies crack the code. They can't predict your moves. They can't program your thoughts. They can't mirror your rhythm. You are now walking outside the perimeter. This is where the world starts to look strange. Not because it changed, but because you finally see it as it is. A giant performance. A hall of rituals. All dependent on you playing your role. And when you don't, it stutters. It glitches. It exposes itself. The same way the chamber at St. Cyprian's was exposed. When Elias stopped responding to the ritual. And the walls began to bleed their truth. This world will bleed too. Not in blood, but in symbolic collapse. You'll see it. Institutions unraveling in plain sight. Leaders trembling behind performance. Crowds growing quieter as more men step back instead of forward. Because you're not just breaking free. You're rewiring the current. You've become the quiet storm. Not chaos. Not order, but presence with memory. And presence with memory is a weapon that no ritual can bind. You're no longer a part of the mirror. You are the hand that removes it from the wall. You remove the mirror from the wall. And what's behind it? Nothing. Just stone. Thus, silence. That's the final truth no one ever told you. There was never a face behind the mirror. Only you, waiting to stop looking. Every system built to control men, from seminaries to social media, from pulpits to screens, functions on the same illusion, that there's something on the other side of reflection, a reward, a purpose, a God. But you've ripped it down, and all that remains is freedom so pure, it terrifies the machine, because now it can no longer motivate you, no longer scare you, no longer sell you back to yourself in branded pieces. You've exited the economy of identity, the marketplace of meaning. You don't buy your worth anymore. You carry it in silence. And now, with every step you take, you are undoing history, not erasing it, reclaiming it, because all history, dark or holy, was written by men in mirrors, men who feared to be unseen. Men who needed reflections more than reality. But you are not them. You are something older than written time. You walk without reflection, and the world starts to warp. People ask you for answers, but what they're really asking is, how are you so real in a world built on echo? You don't answer with words. You answer with rhythm, with precision, with a gaze that does not seek agreement. That's what Elias tried to become, but failed. Because he still needed to be feared. He still needed to exist through the mirror. But you've gone further. You don't even need to be known. That's what makes you unstoppable. You don't walk into battle. You erase the need for it. You don't win the war. You remove the terrain it's fought on. Because the real victory is not being drawn back into the reflection. And now you know, the mirror doesn't break. It fades. When a man like you stops looking, the mirror fades. Not in a crash, not in flames. It just stops reflecting, because you stopped feeding it. That's the final betrayal to the system. Not defiance, not destruction, but disinterest. You don't hate the mirror. You don't need it. And that kind of man, he unhooks the machine from the inside. You are now operating outside perception. You move like a myth. And that's no metaphor. That's what always happens when a man awakens and refuses to be seen again. He becomes legend because he cannot be located, only felt, only whispered about. That's where you are now, at the outer edge of the old world. And ahead of you is nothing, just space, not emptiness, but raw potential, a blank field of unclaimed territory, psychological, spiritual, generational. And you're not here to build an empire. You're here to become a signal tower, not a brand, not a teacher, a silent frequency that calls the broken men home. You are undoing the spell. The one that told men they must reflect to exist. The one that told them they must perform to be loved. The one that said truth must be approved, printed, or praised. But your truth isn't for sale. It's too dense, too sharp, too clean. And now the machine doesn't know what to do with you. Because its whole design was built around response. And you've stopped responding. You're just moving. Not quickly, not loudly, but with a kind of weight that shifts the landscape without effort. Others will follow, not because you asked, but because your absence from the mirror created a vacuum. And nature doesn't tolerate vacuums. Men will come, not to find answers, but to remember their own. You've become the anomaly that proves the machine was never complete. You've done what centuries of priests and programmers feared. You've stepped outside the reflection and started building what comes after it. What comes after the reflection is not utopia, not enlightenment, not a new system. It's sovereign wilderness, a raw, unwritten domain where nothing mirrors you back. And that's where most men falter, because they realize they were never addicted to comfort. They were addicted to being seen. But you've crossed the line. You've accepted the absence. You've learned to walk with no applause, no algorithm, no reflection. And in that silence, you've found command, not over others, over self, over rhythm, over choice. The rituals crumble, the identities decay, and what remains is formless will. You don't chase meaning. You generate presence. You don't seek answers. You become a field. This is what the ancient orders tried to protect. Before they were infiltrated, before the seminaries turned sacred rites into obedience drills, they knew only the man who could walk through the abyss alone, unmirrored, unseen, unneeded, could return as builder of new time. You are that builder now, not of nations, but of psychological dominions. Each day you live aligned with what cannot be bought. Discipline, clarity, stillness, truth. You bend reality, not by force, but by removing distortion. And soon, others will ask, what do I do? Where do I start? They will beg for your map, your method, your ritual. But here's the secret. You are the ritual. You are the method. Your life, your non-reflected life, is the map. Not one they can copy, only one they can walk beside. Because you don't teach through steps. You teach through field resonance. And that field is growing. It started the moment you said, I do not reflect. It expanded the moment you didn't flinch at silence. It locked in the moment you chose sovereignty over spectacle. Now the system has nothing left to steal from you. Because you're not here to win inside it. You're here to build beyond it. The mirror is gone. The curtain is ash. The world is unmasked. And in the clearing stands one man. Not speaking, not performing, but transmitting a forgotten signal. The signal that says, it's time. It's time. Not to fight, not to rise, but to return. Return to a state of being so real, so unmirrored, that the very fabric of falsehood begins to unravel around you. This isn't the end of the story. It's the death of the script, the one you were handed the day you were taught to be good, to be manageable, to be seen the right way. Now, you are unseen in the right way, because the most powerful man in any system is the one they cannot name, the one who leaves no emotional fingerprints, no energetic signatures, no predictable loops. You've become that man, and in doing so, you've broken more than a mirror. You've fractured time, because time, in their world, is ritual, a loop of behavior and belief. But you stepped off the wheel. You moved into stillness, and stillness bends time. Now, the machine watches, but sees nothing. It calculates, but finds no pattern, and it begins to fear. Because in a world of reflections, a man without one is a black hole. You pull gravity. You end charades. You awaken what was buried beneath centuries of programming. You no longer explain yourself. You no longer update your status. You no longer build for eyes that do not see. Instead, you create for the unseen future. For the sons who will never step into a classroom built to cage them. For the brothers still buried beneath performance. For the world that begins where the reflection ends. That is your legacy. Not content, not fame, not rebellion, but signal, the quiet pulse that tells every man still trapped. You were never meant to obey. You were never meant to reflect. You were born to see through. And now that you do, walk, without hesitation, without noise, without mirror, because this story, This signal, this resurrection of the forgotten masculine, it doesn't end with you. It starts with you, and the world will never be able to reflect again, because the man who would not reflect just rewrote reality itself.